good evening to Australia. I would like to welcome everybody to our free web workshop today on unlocking performance post-lockdown together with our joint venture partner, Trinity P3. And I would like to welcome Darren,
thanks,
who's the
Dennis.
global CEO and founder of Trinity P3. Darren, I feel the world feels a little bit upside down. So it's good to have an opinion from down under. And so how's the situation in Australia?
Yes, it's only when the world's turned upside down that suddenly Australia comes to the top. We actually had some very good news today, Dennis, that the government met and they've mapped out a 3-stage program to bring us back out of the lockdown that we've experienced over the last 2.5 months, because the numbers are looking so good. Having said that, all of the indications are that Australia, along with most of the world, is going to roll into a recession, which has incredible impacts for marketers everywhere. Well, business and marketers everywhere. So the big difference for me is the fact that the credit squeeze, or the global financial crisis, the global recession, hit almost every business equally. I mean, once the subprime mortgage collapse and the cash became king, and very few people had cash, so all businesses were affected equally. What we're seeing here is that not every business and not every category has been impacted. Clearly, categories like travel, hospitality, these have been heavily affected. But then we're seeing other categories, and you mentioned toilet paper, commodity items, food items, personal protection equipment for the health industry. These are all boom categories at the moment. The one thing, though, that we, as you say, is that there is going to be a shortage of money. I mean, almost every central bank is printing money to basically fund what needs to be done to stop this becoming an even greater human travesty. So eventually, we're all going to have to pay for that. All that extra money flowing in to pay for this, we will pay for. And we'll pay for that through there being a shortage of cash, and we'll be in recession. The difference was that back in 2008, 2009, I had a lot of marketers approach us and go, my budget's been cut by 30 or 40%. What can I do about it? And back then, we'd say to them, well, we can work through and work out where cuts can be made. But they would often turn to their agencies and say, my budget's been cut by 30%. The agency would go, it's okay. We'll do the same work for 30% less. What that actually done by doing that? Well, from an agency's perspective, they were thinking, I'm helping my client. The message they were actually sending was, I can do the same work for 30% less. And that's viable and sustainable. So we've seen almost all of the major holding companies that are publicly listed see their share prices be diminishing, especially in the last 3 years. Now, why is that? Because the agencies have had this downward price pressure on them for quite a while. And in fact, we've got a terrific graph here that shows this one here. Actually, my colleague, Michael Farmer in the US, he's been tracking what he calls SMUs, scope metric units, which is a unit of agency productivity. So it's for a certain amount of work, how many resources are required. And he's been tracking the price per SMU. Now, you can see here, he started in the 1990s, mid-1990s, and it was up at around $450,000 US per SMU. Now, over time, that's dropped down to around 132,000. So that gives you the curve of how agency fees have dropped over that time. That's for creative and digital agencies. This is a prime example of the way the cost of agencies has actually decreased over time under that downward pressure. And it really did start at around 2007, 2008 with the global financial crisis. So the question is, this time, a marketer is going to be able to go to their agency and go, I've got 30% less budget, or I've got 40% less budget. Could you do the same amount of work? The agencies do not have anywhere near the leeway in their business margins to be able to accommodate that.
You once mentioned to me, we can still generate the same marketing output with 30% less budget without actually discussing the agency fees. Can you explore on that a little bit more?
The problem is that if you're producing 3,000 pieces of work through your agency and it's all the same, there's nothing that differentiates one from another. You know, every piece of work is considered equally important, and yet we know that it's not equally important. So the secret to getting greater productivity and saving money from your agencies is to start using a priority matrix. And I think most people in business understand how a priority matrix works. It's about taking the work that you're doing and starting to prioritize what's the most important, what's the least important, and even what shouldn't we be doing because it doesn't actually fit. It's amazing when we look at so many scopes of work, how much work falls into this sort of producing collateral or commodities that are seen to be needed, but don't actually get linked to a function of either driving brand value or financial value. So here's an example of one, and it's a very simple example, but we used it for a consumer packaged goods company. And what we said to them is, you've got this house of brands, you've got all of these different products sitting in this. Are all those brands equally important to you? And of course, they're not. There are certain brands that have high strategic importance or have high financial return, or both. And then there are others that have low strategic importance and low financial return. And then there's the ones in between. So the first stage was to actually start working with the marketers to get them to think about the brands, not as if they're all equally important. Because I don't think there's a single brand manager alive who doesn't think that their brand that they're responsible for isn't the most important brand in the portfolio, if not the world. But what you need to do is start to think about those brands. So I'll give you an example. We worked with a food company, and they had a product, a brand that had large market volume and made terrific margins. But they also had an older brand that was now waning, and it was starting to decrease. And really all they were doing strategically was that they were now managing that decline. But the actual returns on investment were actually very small, because the reason they were managing the decline was the cost of exiting making that product would have been quite significant. So it was more about reducing loss than it was getting a return on investment. Okay, so we started talking to them about your growth brands you put in usually in tier 1, your declining brands will often end up in tier 3. Why is this important? Well, because then you can start having a conversation with the agency to say, we want to not pay you on the amount of hours it takes you to do the work, but on the value that that work represents to our business. And so you can start to have a conversation around measuring or paying for the value of the work, not the number of hours. Because, an agency will tell you it takes the same number of hours to do an outdoor ad, whether it's for a tier 1 brand, a tier 2 or a tier 3. So, but why would you pay the same amount? Just because their cost base is the same doesn't mean the value that that represents to you is the same. We think the secret to getting greater productivity and therefore more bang for your dollar or your euro is actually putting in place a framework, this prioritization framework.
And I think this is definitely an immediate work that a lot of marketeers now need to do, because exactly that framework could now have as well changed due to Corona crisis.
When we've put this in place, we actually recommend that every 6 to 12 months, they completely review the portfolio to see if any of these brands have moved. And in one case, we had a product, it was a new product launch. Now, the return on investment in the first year was not expected to be high, but it was strategically important. After the first year, when they went back to visit it, the product hadn't done as well as they thought. So they were able to drop it from tier 1 to tier 2 because they were going to invest less money in that product. Whereas under a traditional model, they would still be just pouring money into the agency. Now, you're probably sitting there saying to yourself, well, where do the savings come from? You know, all you're talking about is prioritizing and having a tiered approach. And that comes about here. This looks quite busy, but this is an example of what we call an output-based rate card. And I'll go to the next slide to give you the details on it. What we have here is it has actually 4 levels of work: origination, extension, and adaptation. And what we're saying here is if the agency is creating something from scratch, it's origination. If they're refreshing or extending an existing campaign, that's a different piece of work. And then if they're just adapting an existing campaign, it's different again. And look, these numbers are just indicative, but you look at broadcast TV, you can see that the prices to the agency decrease depending on whether it's origination, extension, or adaptation. So that they were turning the process around from having a retainer where the conversation is the number of hours, the salaries, the overhead and the profit margin and how many FTEs do we need and that type of thing, to talking about what is it that we want the agency to produce. Now, in every single case of actually applying the prioritization matrix and then linking that to a tiered output rate card, we have seen a saving of around 20 to 30 to 40%. And it's not because we're reducing hourly rates, we're just setting a price for the agency to actually work with in delivering the outcomes or the outputs to the quality expected. There is resistance to the model, okay? The first one I strike, first of all, I'll deal with brand resistance. The first one is sitting there and talking to a brand manager and telling them that their brand is tier 3. Because as I said before, almost every brand manager likes to think that their brand is the most important brand. So this is really just bringing a business reality to the brand manager. It's usually done through giving them a smaller budget, but it actually allows you to start to look at your portfolio of brands or your services and start to tier those. The other thing it requires is it does require an increased level of discipline because it becomes a user pay system. Under a lot of retainers, the brand managers will continue to ask for work from the agency and the agency will invariably continue to do it under a retainer because they want to help their client and then just literally burn up resources, including money, doing whatever's asked of them. So that's on the brand side, the typical resistance that you'll get. On the agency side, agencies love retainers because a retainer says to us, here's the number of FTEs, you're going to pay their salary and overhead and a profit margin, hopefully, and then I don't have to worry about it. Now, here's the downside of that, is that almost never do agencies actually get that level right. There is almost always more work than they've allowed for with the resources, so people get overutilized, overworked. In Asia, we've had people in the last 3 years die on the job from overwork. Actually, literally work to death inside agencies. So that's, in fact, if you want a bit of light reading, it's not light reading, Michael's book, Madison Avenue Manslaughter, it's a terrible word, but it is literally manslaughter. The downward pressure over the last 15 years has actually turned advertising into a bloodbath. And it's because we have seen lower and lower prices, but in return, they're juniorising staff, they're not looking for ways of being more efficient. In fact, sadly, I had a digital agency. We put one of these output-based models, and the digital agency said to me, we can't afford to produce those digital ads, those display ads, at the price on that output-based rate card. And I said, well, lots of other agencies are, why not? And he said, well, we do it all manually. Each ad is actually done by a person in the studio. And I said, including the resizing to the 7 or 8 different, yes, it's all done manually. I said, why do you do that? Because there's software that will automate that. Yes, but if we did that, we charge by the hour. And if we put it into software, we can't charge by the hour because it does it virtually instantly. See how a remuneration model actually worked against innovation. The agency could produce those ads much cheaper and faster and with less mistakes, but they couldn't charge for it under a model that is based on the number of hours people are working.
I see the big advantage of output-based performance models is that we have that agencies have as well a motivation to make themselves more efficient.
Well, because moving the model to paying for the outputs, the marketer, the advertiser gets the advantage of technology innovation, and the agency gets a way to charge for something that no longer has very many hours on it. The thinking, the coming up with the idea in the first place, and especially for the tier 1 type work, is where the value really exists. The implementation to roll it out through a whole lot of collateral should be low cost.
Good. I think we have another question from the audience.
Hey, I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Can you hear me?
Hi, thank you so much. It was just a simple question of saying that, so from my perspective where I work, I sit on the other side of the wall, so we are contracting agencies for a specific body of work. And so far we've started thinking about incorporating, or we have done also in the past, some incentive models. And my question was more if we start using a priority matrix and we actually define our priorities well, so with a good level of accuracy, then is still an incentive in the model something that should be considered, or does it actually take out the value of having an incentive model for performance within the contract?
Okay, and look, that's a terrific question, because what we've done in implementing this, and especially where there's been an incentive model in the first place, okay, so even under the retainer, a lot of people have made it very easy to take a percentage of the retainer and turn that into the bonus that gets paid. What we've actually done is said, depending on the agency and their strategic importance, the bonus should come from the investment with that either tier 1 or tier 2 work. So we actually also prioritise our suppliers. We have a tier 1 suppliers, tier 2 and tier 3. We incentivise tier 1 on performance of the brand. So if the brand is doing well, brand tracking, or, in some cases where it's direct response sales or whatever, we use that for tier 1. For tier 2, we do it around things like efficiency innovation. So if they can show ways of becoming even more efficient, then we would have a bonus scheme to reward them for becoming more efficient. And then tier 3, which are more your commodity suppliers, we don't have. So the bonus scheme, to answer your question directly, doesn't exist within the matrix, it sits on top of that. But the matrix actually gives you a very clear focus of what you've been paying for.
Okay, Crystal, thank you very much. That answers a lot of my questions.
My pleasure.
So, quick question, Darren. Is this approach something that should be regarded as a threat for the agency, or is this an opportunity for agencies to do things better, do you think?
Well, a lot of agencies, their initial reaction is that it's a threat. But only about 18 months ago, I was talking to the CEO of a major agency in the US, and he could see this as a benefit. And here's why. Most of his clients, you know, tier one top agency in New York, servicing multi-million-dollar clients in the US, but he was losing more and more work to smaller, lower cost agencies. And when he talked to the marketers, they said, well, the problem is you're too expensive. You know, they didn't say tier 2 and tier 3 work, but they said, we're basically taking off you all this tier 2 and tier 3 work, and some of it's going in-house, and some of it we're finding other people to do it. Now, he said this model for him would have allowed him to say to his clients, see, we can do, and we have a pricing matrix for this different type of work. So tier 1 work will go through the main agency, and tier 2 will go through this, and tier 3 will go through here. And he said, because the biggest challenge they've got is that agencies you'll often see in the trade press, they've won such, you know, a big client, but increasingly they're only getting a very small, a fraction of the actual work that the client's putting through, because it's either going in-house or it's going to other, you know, low-cost agencies.
I mean, on one side, we discussed now, okay, make your prioritization. It may change as well your strategic, the weight of strategic topics versus the weight of sales topics. Then agency compensation model is definitely another topic. But I think one thing too is focusing on those channels that generate the best return on investment, which is one of the dimensions that you have.
Yeah.
So which are the really effective channels that you should focus on?
So we've already seen a shift. Obviously, marketers are moving their media investment into different channels. You know, one of the things that we have seen, especially in the US and other markets, is that television, even though you'd think people working from home would be watching more television, they're actually putting more money online, because the thinking is the people are sitting at home looking at their computers if they're working. We saw a drop in podcast time, because podcasts, people usually listen when they're commuting, and no one's commuting at the moment. So, you know, there's been some fundamental shifts. The single biggest problem is that for too many marketers and too many agencies, they're trying to be in every channel. Now, if you can't afford to be in every channel, and very few marketers can, what you should be looking for is identifying those channels specifically for your brand that give you the biggest return on investment. Now, that return on investment could be direct sales, it could be brand awareness or brand saliency, whatever the measure of success is for your media activity. That's what you should be looking at. But this idea of having to be in every channel, you end up putting what we call spreading the chicken feed very thin, rather than focusing on the specific channels that you can own. That's a strategy for now. The strategy post-COVID is being even more diligent in looking at the channels that are going to target your audience, rather than just going for mass reach. Unless you're a P&G, I mean, I think it's amazing that P&G doubled down, so doubled their media expenditure. Well, why wouldn't you? Everyone's washing their hands, everyone's washing their clothes, everyone's at home looking after themselves, buying P&G products. So this is a boon time for them, and if they've got the cash, they should do it. But for the vast majority of marketers, you're going to be doing more with less. So you should be becoming much more strategic at working with your media agencies to identify the channels that are giving you that return. And that means actually testing and learning in some cases.
I think it was very interesting to see, though, although we have COVID now and things are turning upside down and down under becomes Europe and Europe becomes down under, there is definitely some prioritization work that now needs to be done. There needs to be an assessment. What is my changed environment? how have all these COVID restrictions that we have and changes in my supply chain and changes in my product demand, in my customer behavior, what kind of immediate impact they have. Make a matrix for that immediately, but then as well start to plan what are the long-term effects, which we probably don't even know yet. And either we then drop back and go back to how it was before, because before was better, then we're fine, we're taking the old plans, or it is really a changed environment and we need to do all our marketing plans and our media plans and all these things totally new, which is exciting time for marketing.